right, good afternoon to everyone this afternoon, and thank you for joining us despite the rain. So today we're happy to bring you the COP28 Public Lecture, Are We on Track to Averting Climate Catastrophe, which is brought to you by the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. And for those of you who are not from NUS, welcome to our campus. My name is Melissa Loh. I'm a research fellow at the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, and I have the pleasure of being your host as well as your moderator for the panel discussion afterwards. So today we are here to discuss a very serious topic, climate change. As many of you know, some 70,000 people will be headed to Dubai in less than 2 weeks for COP28. COP28 is set to be a course-correcting COP, where the first ever global stocktake under the Paris Agreement will take place. So countries will need to finalize also the sources of funding for the newly established Loss and Damage Fund and agree on a global goal for adaptation this year. And all this is, of course, happening amidst rising geopolitical tensions, rising cost of living, and other challenges. Today, we have an amazing lineup of speakers and panelists to delve into the heart of the upcoming COP28 meetings. We will also be exploring the role of research and partnerships in charting a sustainable future. And to kick off our proceedings for this afternoon, I have the pleasure of inviting up to stage President of NUS, Professor Tan Eng Chai, to deliver opening remarks. Professor Tan, please.
Thank you, Melissa. Dear guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a warm welcome to NUS. Now, we are fast approaching COP28, which is the United Nations Climate Change Conference. It will be held in Dubai from 30th of November to 12th of December. The call to action is urgent. Against a backdrop of extreme weather events and a series of alarming reports by climate scientists around the world, there is clear evidence of the escalating climate impact driven by rising emissions. The international community convening in Dubai will be working to secure a bold and ambitious outcome to help avert a climate catastrophe. Now, climate action entails trade-offs and sacrifices. There's no easy way out. To steer the course of global action effectively and to secure buy-in, decisions and recommendations must be based on scientific insights and evidence. The latest reports, including the synthesis report of the first global stocktake, point to what must be done to bring down emissions. At COP28, policymakers will lay out how they plan to respond. Now today, our esteemed speakers will delve into the space between science and policy and how this interplay will shape the trajectory of achieving climate goals worldwide. They will also explore how global communities' commitments can be upheld when supported by domestic policies, and also discuss the challenges and opportunities involved. Our speakers today are researchers and scientists from academic institutions. It underscores the important role that universities as bastions of knowledge, innovation, and education play in the complex and pressing global issues. Now at NUS, we are proud to contribute to these discussions, shaping solutions for the future. This year marks the 10th year of our accreditation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Our first Chief Sustainability Scientist, Professor Koh Lian Pin, will be leading a delegation of staff and students to participate in COP28, and we have some of the students here today. The NUS team will be observing negotiations, convening panel discussions, as well as engaging partners on how science can be applied to real-world challenges. Our commitment to sustainability, of course, goes beyond participation at climate conferences. NUS researchers are actively involved in developing tangible solutions to climate change. For example, research at our Center for Hydrogen Innovations can pave the way for hydrogen to be a viable alternative to fossil fuels. Now, research groups at NUS are also looking into how countries can better prepare for the effects of climate change. For example, they are studying the human body's response to rising temperature and also ways to increase food and water security. Universities also contribute to building a sustainable future through developing a green talent pipeline and nurturing the next generation of leaders and change makers in climate and environmental science, policy, as well as sustainability. At NUS, we offer more than 800 sustainability-centric courses and 11 master's degrees in areas related to sustainability. Today's COP28 lecture is part of the university's efforts to generate thoughtful discussions on this planetary crisis that the whole humanity is facing. I encourage everyone to engage actively. It is an opportunity to broaden our knowledge and perspectives, and I hope you will be inspired and equipped to take action. In closing, I extend my appreciation to both our audience and our esteemed speakers for your presence today and your commitment to the cause. I also thank the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions for putting this event together. On this note, I wish everyone a very fruitful session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tan. We start our lecture this afternoon with a presentation from Dr. Aisha El-Sarihi. Aisha is a research fellow at the Middle East Institute, based here at the National University of Singapore. Her areas of research expertise and interests include clean energy policy and climate economics, policies and governance, with a special focus on the Arab region. Aisha, please.
It is my great pleasure to be with you all today, and special thanks to the Center for Nature-Based Solutions for putting this event together. We currently stand today in critical juncture for climate action as we stand between the 2015 target of the Paris Agreement and our goal to achieve 43% decline in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So, as we know, COP28 is happening in less than 2 weeks, and so I'm glad that I have the opportunity to discuss with you today on where we stand on our climate action and where we need to be. So my presentation today will have 3 elements. The first element, we will look at the discrepancy between the climate science and the climate policy. And secondly, I'll focus on the significance of COPs. Why do we have COPs? And of course, because COP28 is taking place in Dubai, in the UAE this year, and the expectations are high, we will discuss on whether this COP will be a course correction COP. So to begin with, I think it is a good idea to revisit the issue that we have in hand, climate change. What is climate change? So climate change happens when we alter the composition of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Naturally, we need greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because greenhouse gases formulate a blanket where it allows the solar radiation to come to the Earth, but at the same time it helps in re-radiating the heat back to the space, and that is important to keep the Earth warm, not too cold and not too hot. But once the concentration of the greenhouse gas emissions become high in the atmosphere, the blanket becomes thick. So the re-radiation of the heat back into the space become less and the Earth become warm. And this is why we see implications of the changes of the climate on our Earth. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have made efforts on understanding whether these greenhouse gas emissions are associated with natural events or they are induced by human activities. And the sixth report, the IPCC have been established in 1988, and today we have enough scientific evidence that shows a direct link between greenhouse gas emissions and the rise in the temperature. And the latest report emphasized that human activities are responsible for the global warming. The implications of the climate change are felt at every corner on Earth. The floods, the cyclones, the heat waves, the rise in the temperature, the dust storms, and also if you think about the haze pollution, that is also linked to the climate change. So the impacts of the climate change is not looming in the horizon, it's actually here with us. Also, the science warned us that the rise of the temperature beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to have catastrophic impacts to our life. And this figure here is nicely showing how the rise in the temperature to 2 degree or 3 degree and 4 degree is going to have implication on the rainfall patterns and the precipitation. And as temperature increase, the global warming, the implications of it will be felt very harshly. I also wanted to share this figure prepared by the WWF, which shows how the climate risks will be different between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius of warming. For instance, the extreme weather events will increase by 100% in case of the floods, and under 1 degree Celsius scenarios, and under 2 degrees Celsius scenarios, the flood risk will increase by 170%, and so on so forth for other implications on species, on the water availability, sea level rise, and also the food security. Also, what the science have shown us, it shows us, we now understand that although we have made efforts to tackle the climate change and cut greenhouse gas emissions, the current policy pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions according to the IPCC will take us to 3.2 degree rise in the temperature by the end of the century. And to keep the global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will need rapid and deep decline in greenhouse gas emissions. Also, although there are efforts to increase the investments in clean energy, there is also a great discrepancy between where we stand today in terms of investments, which is around $755 billion, and that for us to achieve the goals of the net zero targets needs to triple and also or increase 4 times by 2030. So why do we have COPs? Before answering that question, I wanted to give a definition of the COP. COP refers to the Conference of the Party, and the Conference of the Party is the supreme body, a decision-making body for the UNFCCC, which I will define later. And the COP meets, the Conference of the Party meets every year, unless it's decided otherwise, as would happen during the COVID-19 in 2020, which was delayed for the next year. And the first conference of the party was held in Berlin in 1995. A major role of the conference of the party is to provide the platform for the negotiations, and that platform helps to review the collective progress of the nations and other stakeholders on where they stand on tackling climate change and meeting the objectives of the UNFCCC. And the COP, traditionally is hosted in rotation in the 5 recognized UN regions in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. And this year, last year it was in Africa, for example, and this year it will be in Asia, in Dubai. So the major issues that are discussed in COP is the mitigation, the adaptation, the finance, and most recently, the loss and damage has been added to the profile of the discussion. So, as I mentioned, the first COP was held in 1995 in Berlin, but the COP is actually the conference to the party to the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was actually established in 1992. And before that, it is the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was established in 1988, is actually the recommendations from its first assessment report has actually led to establishment of the UNFCCC. And so the COP happens every year, and the COP also enables a platform for negotiations. But the major outcomes or critical outcomes of COP are the one that happened in the third COP in 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, and then in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted. The reason for that, because these COPs set the goals for the cutting of the greenhouse gas emissions, and they have also put forward the standards for meeting those cut in the greenhouse gas emissions. Also, the COP in Glasgow in 2021 was a significant COP because it has finalized the Paris Agreement rulebook. So I'm going to highlight more on the COP3 and COP21 because these are one of the significant COPs in the history of COP meetings. So the COP3, during which the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, has set binding targets for greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced to the levels of 1994. It has 2 periods of commitment, the period between 2005 and 2012, which aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5% compared to 1994. And the second commitment was from 2013 to 2020, aiming to reduce the emissions by 18% by 2020. The Kyoto Protocol, though, has focused on, the industrialized countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and the developing countries did not have the obligation to cut emissions. And the Kyoto Protocol was top-down in nature. In comparison, the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015 and is still running up to today, has a bottom-up approach. It has a universal participation, requiring the participation of developed and developing countries in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And the Paris Agreement has defined the goal of the temperatures that we need to keep in mind to avoid the catastrophic impacts of the climate change. Also, what is difference the difference that brought by Paris Agreement, it asked the parties to the UNFCCC to submit nationally determined contributions now within the time frame of every 5 years. So these NDCs helps to monitor the progress of the countries in tackling climate change, both in mitigation and adaptation. Also, another COP, which is a critical COP, I would say, is the COP26 that was held in Glasgow in 2021. Why is it critical? First of all, it was held right after the release of the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius report, which set a target for the peak of the emissions by 2025 and the decline for emissions by 43% by 2030. So the release of the IPCC 1.5 report actually created the momentum for to achieve the net zero goals by the mid-centuries, and more than 100 countries now have set net zero target. Also, why the COP26 is important, because it finalized the rule book for the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2018. The Paris rule book sets the regulations for the countries on how they can meet their mitigation and adaptation ambitions. Also, there was progress in the transparency and the common reporting, which is an important element to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's also, a progress on the COP26 was the first COP to call for doubling down the adaptation finance by 2025. And also during COP26, the loss and damage, actually the negotiations of it has started there by putting forward the Glasgow dialogue for the loss and damage. And also for the first time, if you look at the Paris Agreement document, you don't see a reference to the fossil fuels, although the fossil fuels are the major source of the greenhouse gas emissions. So for the first time, the Glasgow Climate Pact included the language on the fossil fuels, which says facing down unabated coal. The other important COP was COP27, which was held last year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And this COP also was dubbed as the COP of implementation, or at least that was the hope. Of course, a major success of COP27 is the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. But that Loss and Damage Fund still needs further negotiations in terms of finalizing the institutional arrangements on where the fund will be held and what countries will contribute to the fund and how countries can access the fund. In fact, in the last few weeks, the parties have already met to negotiate the loss and damage fund, and there was an initial agreement for the fund to be held by the World Bank, at least in interim phase, before the countries decide where the fund will be located. So now, if you look at the points here, I put minus or positive. So the positive mean that there was a progress in the negotiation agenda, and the minus, it means the COP has not actually made any progress. So although Egypt has, represented itself as an Africa COP or representing the voice of the global South, we haven't, unfortunately, seen any major progress in terms of the finance, in terms of the adaptation, but there was a little bit of progress in terms of the mitigation. In terms of the finance, the developed countries have made the commitment to deliver $100 billion by 2020 on an annual basis. But unfortunately, that commitment has not been met yet. And also during COP27, a reform of the public finance system has been discussed, and not much of a progress, and this is also goes to be discussed in COP28 in Dubai. The new climate finance goal to be established by 2024 has also didn't see any major progress during COP27, although this goal has been, discussed initially in COP26. And in terms of adaptation, the global goal on adaptation, the definition of it, what are its components, and what is the structure of this goal, still hasn't seen major progress, so this is also left for the COP28. However, Adaptation Fund has received $230 million during COP27, and hopefully this year we will see more of a progress. In terms of the mitigation, there was a progress in terms of the mitigation work program, and the mitigation work program is, it's a program to monitor the progress in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. The agreement that has been achieved at COP27 is to run this program up to 2026 and to be hold 2 dialogues a year in order to provide recommendations for the COP. A progress that happened in the mitigation is that 20 additional countries signed a global methane pledge. And again, in terms of the fossil fuel language, we haven't seen any major progress on the language that was adopted in COP26. The language remained the same, and that is because, the COP27, the last few days of it have seen some kind of contentions between countries around this language, because some countries, especially the oil-producing countries, find the phase down of the fossil fuels will have negative implications on their economies. So there was a coalition to exclude the phase out of the fossil fuels from the cover decision. So again, the language on the fossil fuels will be brought up again in the COP28. Looking closely at this, the phase down and phase out of the fossil fuels, actually what is also holding the countries back from agreeing on this language is the lack or the short of the studies that are showing the modeling needed for the assessing the socio-economic implications of the phase down and the phase out of the fossil fuels. And a major element that will be discussed at this year's COP is the global stocktake. Now, global stocktake actually, which is an important element at COPs, because it makes the transition from ambition to the implementation. The global stocktake, what it is a measurement tools for assessing the collective progress of countries in meeting the Paris Agreement goals, both in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And it also tells countries where they stand today and where they need to be. So based on that, countries will be asked to submit their NDC with accelerated climate ambition and action every 5 years. So during COP27, the second technical dialogue of the first global stocktake was completed. And this year, it will be a critical year for the global stocktake, because it will conclude the first ever phase of the global stocktake. And the countries will be told on where they stand in their climate ambitions and where they need to be. And also there are other elements has been discussed. For the first time, the nature-based solutions were included in the cover decision of the COP27, and this will be discussed further also this year. So now moving to the COP28, and I ask this question, will it be a course correction COP? Now again, the expectations are high. So we know COP28 will be held in Dubai. The picture on the top is from the Expo City Dubai, where the COP will be held. The UAE presidency says that 70,000 delegates will be there this year, and 40 heads of states will participate, along with the observers from NGOs, IGOs, and the UN agencies, as well as the media. If you haven't been to the COP, mainly there are two halls: the Blue Zone hall, where the accredited parties and observer delegates can participate, so you need the badge for that. And in the Blue Zone also the formal negotiations takes place. There's also a Green Zone. So the Green Zone is a free of charge. One doesn't need accreditation to attend the free zone, the Green Zone, but it's also provide a good platform for the businesses, for the public to attend, and the civil society, the youth, indigenous people or group to attend this Green Zone and participate in different activities or the side events that takes place. So again, why the expectations are high for this year COP, and why we think it's going to be a course correction COP. As mentioned by the professor in the opening remarks, the first global stocktake synthesis report was published in September this year, and it clearly states that global surface temperature already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. It also states that our current climate pledges will take us to 2.4 and 2.6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And it also states where we need to be. It states that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we require rapid and deep reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the decades after peaking, of around 43%, 60%, 84% below 2019 levels by 2030, 2035, and the mid-century. So clearly we are off track of meeting the Paris Agreement goal and keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. And the report clearly call for accelerated climate action. This is just the figure from the report where it shows the discrepancy between the current climate pledges that are stated in the nationally determined contributions and where we need to be in cutting greenhouse gas emissions to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So in terms of the key issues to be discussed during COP28, if you're going, these are the major issues: the loss and damage, the modalities of it, who will finance and how the finance will be transferred, and where the fund will be based. The other issues that I discussed also for the COP27, which haven't received any progress, will continue to be discussed during this year COP. In terms of the finance, the UAE during the pre-COP meetings have highlighted on the importance of mobilizing the developed countries to commit to the 100 billion finance from developed to developing countries, and also has been reiterating the importance of reform of public finance system, and also making a progress on the new climate finance goal by 2024. Other issues that I think also will gain more attention during COP28 is the global, of course, the global stocktake, because the first technical report has been released, and now during COP28, the discussion will be on the political phase of concluding the first global stocktake. And so countries will discuss the outcomes of the global stocktake report, and they will take position on how they can ratchet up their ambitions in terms of the mitigation and adaptation to the climate change. And these decisions, they will be included in the cover decision by the end of the COP28. And based on that, countries are, of course, if it succeeds in terms, and this is the big responsibility for the UAE presidency to bring the countries together. So if they succeed in, mobilizing the global stocktake outcomes, we will see significant results in the cover decision by the end of the COP28. Other issues that I think will gain attention from the UAE presidency is the language of the fossil fuel, on the fossil fuel phasing down or phasing out. As we know, the UAE also an oil-producing country, but has also made efforts to diversify its economy. But pre-COP, we have seen calls on the phase-out of the fossil fuels from different countries, including the EU countries. And last year, it's actually India who actually called for phasing out all fossil fuels. But that, of course, didn't receive, an agreement from the COP27 presidency. So this is an issue to look out for in this year COP. And also another issue I think will gain attention this year is the impact of response measures. What does that mean? The impact of the response measures, mainly those that are aiming to cut greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning away from the fossil fuels. This is a major concern for resource-based economies, including the oil-producing countries, because the implications of it is the reduce the demand of the fossil fuels and consequently reducing the revenues for those countries. So last year, this topic, there was a contention around it. One of the major reasons behind it, there is a lack, of studies on the consequences and the socio-economic implications of the impact of response measures. And that is actually makes the countries worry on agreeing on something that they don't know much about the consequences of. In fact, the UNFCCC actually approached me to write a report on how the impact of response measures are affecting the resource-based economies and what are the options for them to deal with those consequences, for example, through the economic diversification. This is again the global stock take. I give it one slide because I think this is a major topic that will be discussed during COP28. As I mentioned, the conclusion will happen this year, and then countries will be asked to update their NDC by 2025. And the second global stock take also will be concluding in 2028, again in another 5 years. Probably you already heard about the concerns on whether the UAE will play an impartial host of COP28 this year. There were many concerns that the UAE will push for its own interest and that will affect the outcomes of the COP. One reason behind those concerns is the choice of the COP28 presidency, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, because he is the CEO of ADNOC, and he is, maybe what we don't know, he's also the CEO of Masdar, which is a national company for clean energy in the UAE, which invests both in the UAE and the region as well as globally, including actually here in this part of the world. So my analysis on the choice of Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, and because I'm also from the region, I think when it comes to the negotiations and leading the COPs, you need the credentials. You need the qualification to run the negotiations smoothly. So in the Middle East, in the oil-producing countries, the oil industry has a long history compared to other industries, so the human capital is actually there. And excluding the oil industry from the negotiations perhaps could have negative implications than including them in the negotiations. So he has the credential and the know-how about both the traditional industry and the clean energy. So the hope is that he will be playing a neutral role when it comes to the negotiations, but not pushing for the interest of the fossil fuel producers. And also the other concern is emerging on the UAE itself, its position on the climate action. So if we look at the climate action in the UAE, if we look at the oil and gas production, so the production gap report was released last month, actually this month, and it shows that the UAE does have plans to increase its oil and gas production, and at the same time also the UAE has increased its investment in renewable energy installed capacity in the last few years. It's actually having the highest installed capacity of renewable energy in the region, so it has played an early runner role in the renewable energy. Also because I have been looking, throughout my research very closely to the UAE and what the UAE is doing to address the climate change. Actually, the UAE is the first country in the region to align its climate goals with the national development plans. It released a green plan, and it does have a national climate change plan between 2017 and 2050. It is the only Gulf country that submitted a third update of its second NDC, and they have been keeping rising their emission reduction target. The new emission reduction targets is 31% below the business as usual by 2030, compared to the previous one of 23.5% below the business as usual also by 2030. And also the UAE, if you also follow the UAE, it wants to play the role model both regionally and globally. So it was one of the first countries to announce its commitment to achieve net zero goals. And also ADNOC itself, because the Sultan Jaber is the chairman of ADNOC, he is also announced a commitment by ADNOC to achieve net zero by 2045. So phasing out and phasing down fossil fuel is going to be an important issue to look out for. And if we looked at the statements that came out pre-COP28, we can see already kind of, a language that is coming and a focus on phasing out emissions, but not phasing out fossil fuels. So this came through several statements from the UAE, either from Dr. Sultan Al Jaber or from the Minister of the Climate and the Environment in the UAE. And actually, if we looked also to other meetings like the G20 meeting, the statement that came also from there did not change the language in phasing out the unabated coal. It kept the same language that has been included in COP26. So my expectation, but I'm hoping that I'm wrong, my expectation, maybe the language will be kept the same this year as well. So these are the last two slides that I have. The COP28 in terms of the legacy. Now, COP27 legacy was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. The UAE COP, apart from the, making progress on the global stocktake, also would like to make the COP an inclusive COP that, have the participation of the youth, the private sector, the civil society, and the indigenous groups. And so these are the, the major key elements that were set by the COP28 presidency. They want to focus on fast-tracking the energy transition, transforming climate finance system, putting nature, people, lives, and livelihood at the heart of the climate action, and mobilizing the most inclusive COP ever, as stated on the website. And this is this 2 weeks schedule. It was designed around themes, including a focus on the food, water, health as well, and for the first time also peace and security are included. And this is my last slide. Also, I wanted to mention for those who want to attend the COP but don't have the badge, there's a possibility to attend the Green Zone, which is free of charge, and it's open for everyone. It is open for those who don't have accredited delegation, and it provides a platform for the youth, for the civil society, the NGOs and indigenous groups to, work together in finding solutions to the climate change. And the UAE presidency has provided platforms for the youth, including the Youth Climate Champion, international youth delegates, and the UAE youth delegates. And already the UAE has selected 100 youth to participate in the COP. But again, the green zone is open. And also there's an emphasis, the UAE have made an emphasis on including the participation of the private sector. So there's a provided platform for the business and philanthropy climate forum for the private sector to come together and discuss the solutions around the climate and mitigation, the adaptation, and the finance. So with that, I thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to listen to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much to Dr. Aisha. And may I actually invite you back up on stage for the panel discussion, as well as our two panelists. And I'll let my colleagues set up for the Q&A. Okay, all right. So our panel discussion is about to begin. Because of the layout of this room, actually, we've decided to do our Q&A via Slido. And maybe we can put up the Slido QR code just very quickly. Okay. So before we begin the panel discussion, just let me go through a few administrative details. We'll first go into a moderated discussion. I'll introduce our panelists in a bit. We will be using Slido to collect all your questions. So please scan the QR code and key in your questions. We'll get to that in about 20 minutes after we've finished our first round of discussion. So please get your questions ready. If you could include your name, that would be great, so we know who you are. And I think there may be a function to upvote your questions as well. And if there isn't, you can let us know. Okay, so we're also conducting this panel discussion under Chatham House rules. So if you don't know what that is, you may quote what is being said here, but please do not attribute it to any of the speakers. This is so we can facilitate an open and candid discussion this afternoon. Okay, so let's begin. Just let me quickly introduce our two panelists that you're seeing for the first time. Of course, first we have Assistant Professor David Lellermont, who is from the Nanyang Technological University, where he is the head of the Disaster Analysis for Society Lab in NTU. And of course, we also have Associate Professor Angel Su, who is with the Public Policy and Environment, Energy and Ecology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and you're spending a semester here in NUS. So welcome to all our panelists. I'll get started with the first set of questions, but of course, Dr. Aisha, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I learned so much, even though I've been researching on COP for many years. There's always something new to learn, but I do want to start with Dr. Su and give you a bit of a break for now, okay? So Angel, you've been to several COPs now. I wanted to get your thoughts on the agenda for this year and whether you feel optimistic that we will get to a course correction COP this year.
Hello? Oh, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Melissa, for the invitation, and thanks everyone for being here in the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions for organizing this. As Melissa said, this is, I think, my 14th COP. I think we actually went to the very first COP, the same one, Copenhagen, 2009, which was so exciting, but it was also a crashing disaster. And then COP in 2015, COP21, as Aisha mentioned, it was so exciting with this new bottom-up process, and then I think ever since then we've seen some ebb and flows. So I remain an eternal optimist. I'm very optimistic, and I have three reasons why I'm optimistic. So one is exactly the point that Aisha, you made about the global stocktake. This is an incredibly critical phase because it's the culmination of the first global stocktake. And as Dr. Aisha said, the whole premise of the Paris Agreement are these review cycles, these 5-year cycles. And it's based on the idea that you have the countries put forward their nationally determined contributions, what they can do on climate mitigation, adaptation, and financing. And then also you have this 2-year process where we concluded with consultations. Then there was this technical review where we're looking at what everyone has put on the table, done the modeling, the scenarios, trying to find out what the gap is. And then we're heading into this political phase where then countries are going to be asked to review those technical reports and the synthesis to then think about how to lay the agenda out for next year and for the next round of NDC. So it's incredibly critical. And for me, a lot of my research is focused on the role of bottom-up actors. So private businesses, financial institutions, subnational governments, civil society groups, and universities in this ambition loop in this ratchet mechanism. So the idea is that you have some national governments and businesses also contributing as much as they can. And these efforts should, in theory, then also give confidence to national governments to raise the ambition of their pledges. And when I read that synthesis report, the very first page, key finding number 2 was about non-party actors, about non-state actors. That blew my mind. So for folks who have studied the COP process, as long as some of us up here, the UNFCCC, it's really about nation states, it's national governments. And so Paris really upended that by recognizing for the first time the contributions of national or of subnational governments and also of private actors. But then to have on the first page, the second key message, and it specifically said that non-party actors, including indigenous groups, civil society organizations, businesses, subnational governments, are critical for systems transformation needed. That blew my mind. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that? I mean, I've never seen anything like that on an official UN report. And yesterday, I took a car up to Johor. I didn't realize it was so close. It was like 15 minutes, and I was in Johor for the Asia Pacific Climate Week, and I ran into one of my colleagues at the UNFCCC, and he pulled me aside. He said, "Angel, did you read the synthesis report?" I said, "Yeah, of course I did." He said, "Non-party actors were on the first page." I said, "I know. Why isn't everyone freaking out about this?" Because I think that just shows now the political momentum and the support, because he also said they would not, the co-chairs of the GST process would not have put that on the front page as key message number 2 if they didn't have the support of the parties. So I think that's a space to watch, is to really watch that space. And then, but I think secondly, the other side of the coin to the momentum and the excitement is the accountability. So then key message number 3 then quickly countered and said, but we need data, we need accountability, we need transparency in order to make sure that all of these companies that are now participating and critical to achieving systems transformation are making credible actions that are accountable and that we can avoid double counting. So that's also a space that I think is really critical, especially because last year at COP27, there was this high-level expert group to take aim at net zero, because that's, I mean, we could have a whole panel just talking about what net zero means. So it was really interesting to see what the UAE is pledging, because it's not at all aligned with net zero, you know, like an 18% reduction by 2030, like nowhere close. And so they're saying that it's net zero because they're relying on carbon capture and sequestration and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, either through technology or through nature-based solutions. And so I think that's why there's a lot of debate now, and it's going to be taking aim at this particular issue at this COP. Because on our project, the Net Zero Tracker, we're evaluating the largest 2,000 companies, all national governments, and also some national governments on their net zero pledges. 75 fossil fuel companies have made net zero pledges on our tracker. Can I ask, does anyone want to shout out, how many of them do you think are actually credible? Any? You're right, 0. 0. So according to our evaluation, not a single one of these fossil fuel companies has actually made a credible net zero target, because they're doing what UAE and the Abu Dhabi Oil Company are doing. They're saying, oh yeah, we'll go net zero, we're going to reduce emissions 18%, and then the rest of it we're going to try to offset either by these technological means, carbon capture, sequestration, or otherwise. So I think that's going to be an important space. And then lastly, exactly as you said, Aisha, it's the fossil fuels. I think it's no irony that we have the UAE hosting, and then also we have the presidency, also the head of an oil company. And so I think this is going to be a really critical question. And for me, just adding to your very well laid out debate versus phase down or phase out, I think it's also about stopping the support of fossil fuel subsidies. So I think that's really critical. No matter, I mean, I think we're not necessarily at COP28 going to resolve the phase out and phase out, because they've tried every year since COP26 to get that language in there on phase out, and there's just so much resistance. But I think one area where we can universally agree, and I hope we can get some momentum behind, is just stopping the subsidization of fossil fuels. I mean, right now we're looking at $7 trillion, US dollars, in fossil fuel subsidies globally. That's about 7% of global GDP. Why? I mean, that's arbitrarily inflating or I guess depressing the cost of fossil fuels relative to clean and renewable energy technologies. So I was on the IPCC, the 6th assessment report, working group 3 on mitigation. And in that chapter, we made it very clear that clean and renewable energy, solar, wind, battery technology, electric vehicles, all of these technologies, we have all solutions that we need to tackle climate change. And it's because of fossil fuel subsidies that make these other competing energy sources, fossil fuels, cheaper. But it's just distorting markets and the reality that we have all the solutions. So I'm really hoping we can make progress, at least on that piece.
Thanks so much, Angel. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought there, and I think everyone knows that COP is extremely political, and so it is technical in some tracks, but I think this year, especially with the global stock tick kicking into high gear with the political phase, as you say, it's a space to watch, because whether or not countries actually adopt that report or take note of it is a real thing that we're watching very closely. I do want to shift gears a little bit, of course, to David, and I know you research on risks, and of course today's lecture, our title, we intentionally asked an important question, which is, are we on track to averting climate catastrophe? And I want you to answer that question because you study risk. Are you optimistic? Is it too late for us?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for this question, and thank you for the great presentation to frame this conversation. So my background is in disaster risk modeling, and I've worked for over a decade as well in disaster response and recovery. Spending significant amount of times in places that are impacted by a lot of these extreme events. And I think, leading up to this COP, there's a few things that I think are both concerning but sources of hope. So on the concerning end, I think, one, it's important to realize that a lot of the impacts of climate change will be felt through extreme events. And I think we give a big disservice when we talk about 0.5 degree or 1.5 degree or these like very small numbers, because I think people don't feel what that means. And a 0.5 degree change in average doesn't seem significant. We can live with every day being half a degree warmer. That's not the problem. The problem is what it does for extreme events. And we saw that in the slide where at 1.5 degrees, we're talking about 100% increase in flooding and 170% increase in flooding with an extra 0.5. And that's true of all climate extremes. It's true of typhoons. It's true of heat waves, of drought. So that's one thing. The other thing, which was also mentioned, is that the cost of these extremes is not just a problem for tomorrow. We're seeing these costs accumulate today. $100 billion in insured losses has become the norm per year, and that's a huge increase compared to the past. And we've seen insurance companies pull out of protecting regions. These are companies, their entire business is to finance risk. When they refuse to do that, they're the big problem. And obviously, the cost of climate change adaptation will be immense, but the cost of doing nothing will be much, much larger. So these are the sources of concerns. Some of the positives are, in the field of risk modeling, one of the fundamental things that we teach is that it takes three things to create risk and disaster. You need extreme events, so hazards, and climate change is impacting those hazards, making them more intense and more frequent. But you also need exposure, and you need vulnerability. There's little that we can do at the local scale to control the hazards. That's where kind of mitigation is really important, and we need to do that. But there's nothing that Singapore can do by itself to prevent typhoons from happening or the sea level from rising, right? but you also need exposure and vulnerability. We decide where we build our societies, and we decide how to build it. Those two together characterize exposure and vulnerability. So we control our risk, and I think that's very empowering, and we know how to build resilient infrastructure, and we know where the hazards will be. So we can manage this. And we already have a lot of the solutions. Nature-based solutions was mentioned many times, risk-informed urban planning, insurance for financial protections. We have a lot of the tools there. One of the problems is that we don't talk very much about the successes and the things that work because they work. You only hear about the catastrophic floods. You don't hear about the major floods that happen but don't impact anyone because of an amazing protection that was put in place. So I think that's one of the big challenges in my field, which is risk management. So we launched the Averted Disaster Award 2 years ago now, specifically to highlight those invisible successes that no one talks about. Nominations are open, by the way, if anybody wants to apply or send a nomination. And finally, I think one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that when we talk about what it will take to build resilient societies, we talk about better connection with nature, making cities more green, more walkable, more efficient, with less pollution, with social protections for the vulnerable. And these are critical for climate resilience, but these are net positive things. Like we're designing a better society. And I think there needs to be more of that rhetoric, because I think a lot of people are thinking about mitigation or the things that we need to do to prevent catastrophe as things that they will have to sacrifice very significantly for. But actually, like a lot of the visions that are being put forward and a lot of the solutions that are being implemented, I think are helping human development and well-being more broadly, not only addressing climate. And that brings me a lot of hope and excitement.
Right, but thank you very much for those remarks. So I think that's a really good segue because you talk a lot about risk and at the COP, of course, Dr. Aisha already mentioned this year will be about financing the loss and damage financially. We had a really great question. I'm going to move into the audience questions right now, which is, we had a question about your views on the loss and damage mechanism, the Santiago network, and also the fund itself. And I want to get the panelists' view on this. But I did want to give a shout out to whoever asked the question, because I'm sure you're Gen Z, because it says, can Angel share more about their views on loss and damage mechanisms? They slay, by the way. For those of you who don't know, the lingo is definitely Gen Z. So I'm really grateful that we have a very young audience, everyone here in the room. And yeah, I love that question. And I just wanted to ask your views on the loss and damage fund. It's last year was a great year. Obviously, we established the fund, but we couldn't decide on how to fund it, how to finance it. And in your view, any thoughts on whether this year will be the year where they decide to come up with innovative sources of funding? How will they disperse the funds? And is it going to be quick enough to avert disaster? Who would like to take this question? Angel, maybe first?
Oh, I was going to say Aisha.
Oh, Aisha, yes. Then we'll come to you.
Well, so I have been following the loss and damage pre-COP meetings so far, and there are signals that the progress is already slow because of the contention between the developed and developing countries. So the initial proposal is to host the fund by the World Bank, but the developing countries have, gone against this decision because there's a concern on the access of the fund if the World Bank is hosting the fund. And so initially there was no agreement, but then, last week in Abu Dhabi, the countries have decided to make the World Bank as a host of the fund on an interim basis before the establishment of the fund. But again, there will be a discussion who is hosting the fund, of course. And it will take time for the fund to be established and for the procedures of its operation to be agreed on. So with these few signals, I think there's a slow progress, and maybe something would be agreed on in COP28, hopefully. But I would like to listen to Angel.
Not my area of expertise, so that's why I was looking to you for that really very eloquent response. I agree with Melissa. I think that it's incredibly an important political signal that countries, especially the United States was the biggest opponent of the Loss and Damage Fund and really dragged their heels and blocked most of the discussions, I think, leading up to COP26 on loss and damage. And then we had, of course, a change in presidency and leadership, and then I think that helped to change some of the tide on loss and damage. But I mean, by all of the adaptation gap report just came out recently. That's I think is it annual or biannual report by the UN Environment Program that talks about this gap in financing, particularly for adaptation. And it's just shocking in terms of the gap that keeps growing. So you talked about the $100 billion that was agreed upon actually back in 2009. I mean, that's when they agreed on like the $100 billion US dollars needed annually starting in 2020 and then every year after. Now I think the need has gone to 160 to 340. I think that's the range that they're saying is now needed because, again, climate change is a super wicked problem. And the longer we delay, the more tricky it becomes, the more expensive, as David was saying, the more expensive it becomes to then actually tackle the problem. So, I mean, this is one area where just because I've been going to so many COPs, like I feel less optimistic. I think that politically, it's a big deal that we agreed upon the fund, and then these technical, more logistical details of who's going to host it, how much to contribute. I think for me, we need to get countries like China on board. That's probably not a popular opinion, but I think we do. And China's going to say no, because they don't want to blur these lines between non-Annex 1 developing countries and Annex 1 countries. And they'll say, oh, we're already doing a lot of South-South cooperation and already giving countries a lot of support, but I mean, I think it's really tough to actually meet those goals, and we haven't seen that countries have been able or willing to provide that kind of financing. So I think that's another area where there's a lot of talk about public-private partnerships, and also I'm in a lot of conversations right now about how you can try to get private companies or even foundations working together with development finance institutions to go in all together on these big wins or these big bets to try to galvanize more funding, and then hoping that the national governments then follow. But yeah, I agree. I feel like this is somewhere where we need a lot of innovation. We could use a lot of fresh thinking. I don't know, David, if you have any ideas of how to actually get the money mobilized. I feel like it's really tough.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is, once again, a space where I think academia has a big role to play, because I think finding these innovative solutions for financing, maybe they don't exist yet, and maybe they need to be developed. And I know there's been a lot of very exciting research and work in this sphere. I mean, I think the Damage and Loss Fund is incredibly important, and I think it's great that it's going to be kind of a big part of the discussion at COP28. I know that the kind of meetings leading up to this by the technical working group have been very complicated, and some have broken down. But I think it's so important, and I do hope that things don't get marred into kind of some of the operational details, though they are very important. About the host, I do think, for instance, the discussion about whether the World Bank is the appropriate host. I mean, I've been pretty surprised by some of the critique, which is just genuinely not true. For instance, that the World Bank only provides loans. In fact, for post-disaster recovery, which is fundamentally what this is about, they only provide grants, never loans. And there are very few institutions in the world that have the type of social safeguards, environmental safeguards, and can deliver billions of dollars worth of funding to countries, to operational infrastructure projects, and that puts them in a really unique place. Certainly, it's not a perfect institution, and I think some of the critique will hopefully make sure that what they put in place to host this fund will have small overheads. I think that's one of the big kind of pushbacks, for instance, and things like that. So I think that's great. They should, there should be kind of a critical eye on this, but I'm still quite hopeful.
Can I just add, so going back to your point about the net positive, I mean, I'm wondering if because loss and damage, and that was part of the reason why the U.S. was so opposed the idea so much, because it implies reparations. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if it's more of a communication issue, where if you say to DFIs and to private investors and to other financial institutions, you're actually investing in health, you're investing in infrastructure, you're investing in livelihoods and quality of life. Maybe that would get people more excited, actually framing it in a more positive way, as opposed to loss and damage, and this is your fault, and pointing the fingers and saying, oh, because of developed countries, you polluted the climate and you spewed all the greenhouse gas emissions and made our sea levels rise, right? I mean, I'm wondering if it's more of a communication and a framing issue, because I've had conversations with philanthropic organizations, and they don't even like the idea of the term big bet, because it sounds risky and you're gambling. So that's why I said big win, right? And so what if it's more of a communication issue? And I really do think that you're onto something with this net positive. It's oh, actually think about the returns when you're not paying for healthcare cost and for people dying, or to rebuild communities. What if they were just made resilient to begin with?
Yeah, that's going to be a big issue, actually. I think they intentionally removed the term compensation because of that concern that it was to signal that they were responsible, that developed countries were responsible for climate change. Yeah, and then they had to pay reparations to the developing countries that were suffering the worst effects. So I think we'll see some of that discussion coming back at this year's COP, I believe. But Aisha, any other thoughts on that?
Actually, other concern adding to all of this is that also the line, who is contributing to the fund? So there already has been, because the COP is hosted in the UAE, there already has been calls for the UAE and Saudi Arabia to participate in the fund, because these countries are not really classified as developed countries because of the wealth that they have. So probably also this could be a reason to hold any agreement on the fund, because of the concerns of the commitment. And but also another maybe sign of hope that we can look at is the meeting that's going on at the moment between the US and the China president. So this cooperation is really important for the climate. We have been seeing the contention between the US and China for a long time, and that is really, holding some climate issues back, especially the fund, and then also the cooperation in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So this is maybe a sign of hope that this meeting is happening before the COP. But also the two presidents met recently in Bali. So, but I think moving forward, the technicality of establishing the fund will certainly be slow, and then the mobilization of the fund will be slow, and then also to be committed to the fund also. Again, I think you are right, it's the communication, the language that we use, but also I think what holds the countries back also, we don't have enough scientific evidence for all of these kind of debates. We know the consequences, the economic impacts of the loss and damage, but perhaps we don't know what are the net positive outcomes. This is also similar when it comes to the impacts of the response measures. The socioeconomic implications are not well studied. We don't have enough studies on that. So this holds the countries back. So we also need more focus on research, on data, and on the information.
I want to quickly pick up on that point, which is one of the COP28 presidency's objectives is to create a just transition, right, and an inclusive COP. How do you expect that to happen? I mean, it's 70,000 people going there, business, civil society, youth, everyone's going to be there. but also how do we bring everybody else along for the journey, right? So it's kind of related to some of the questions that have been asked, essentially, right? So I think some of you here will know, if you've been to a COP, if you follow COP proceedings, the outcomes are effectively a package deal, right? Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so you can't just look at one topic, you can't just prioritize one item on the agenda. It's everything. It's mitigation ambition, it's adaptation, it's loss and damage, it's the global stocktake. Everything has to be agreed, and everyone goes home a little bit unhappy. Because if we all go home happy means that we've done something terribly wrong for the planet. So what are your thoughts on how to create an inclusive and just transition? How do we do that while phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, or phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, because a lot of people depend on it, right? And so we had a question about, wouldn't that just increase fossil fuel projects, so phasing out fossil fuel emissions, would that not increase fossil fuel projects? Somebody also wanted to know if you could expand on the subsidies issue. How do you ensure that it's just for the people who rely on it, for instance? And how do you think the presidency will handle this tricky topic? I think you covered it a little bit in your presentation, but it's going to be really hard for him, especially when he's wearing all these hats.
Actually, it is a real concern. The energy transition is a real concern for resource-dependent economies, especially the oil-producing countries, because as I mentioned, and especially if we look at the Middle East countries, so they face a climate conundrum. So fossil fuel resources, the revenues that comes from it, it helps in the economic growth of these countries. This is one thing. And on the other hand, the region is one of the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of the climate change, like the heat waves, the floods, the sand and dust storms, the water scarcity. It is the most water-stressed region in the world. And so the oil revenues so far have helped these countries to adopt the technologies that are needed to adapt to the issues of the climate change. It helped in building the water desalination plants for these countries to produce water. It helps also in tackling the food security. Now the agriculture sector is not supporting because of the harsh climate conditions in there. So the countries in the region depend almost 50% to 90% of the food is imported for these countries. So they depend on the other countries, but they of course use the oil revenues for that. So the water desalination, the food security, and also the adoption of the cooling technologies. So for this specific reason, this is why we historically seen these countries are really fighting for the interest on the fossil fuels. So the transition for them, of course, creates a threat, a risk for the most important source of income. However, the countries in the region realize this is not a sustainable approach moving forward. They realize that it is really important to start addressing these issues through the economic diversification. So they are now embarking on, focusing on non-oil sectors, such as the focus on the tourism sector, the airlines, increasing the participation of the private sector. But again, if the collective, cooperation from the global community remains slow, the future of those countries, because of the impacts of the climate change, continue to rise. They will have a short or limited scope and bandwidth for the economic diversification, and also because climate change is also going to affect those new sectors as well, like the tourism. If it is too hot, it's not really attractive for the region. So I think, and the just energy transition, of course, has been a focus for the COP28. actually, one of the think tanks in Abu Dhabi asked us to, co-host a workshop which focused on the just energy transition, and this is one of the challenge that has been discussed. But the countries also understand now it is not useful, to just hold on the fossil fuels. It is also going to be useful for us to participate with the global community in moving forward with the energy transition as well. So there is a momentum for the adoption of the renewable energy. Hydrogen is a big thing for countries like Oman, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. They want also to tap on the hydrocarbon resources and producing the hydrogen. They focus on the carbon capture and storage technology. So they see that the participation with the global community in the energy transition is a way to hedge against the threats brought of the response measure or the energy transition. So for me, I've been looking at the region since I started my PhD back in 2013. When I started my PhD, it was a difficult time because I wouldn't find data on renewable energy. I wouldn't find really stakeholders to speak to about the renewable energy and the energy transition. But now when I visit the region, I'm very optimistic, I'm very hopeful, because now people have awareness about climate change, about the energy transition, at the different levels, the government, civil society, and the private sector. And then also the investment has really increased. So the momentum is there, it has started, and I think it's not gonna take a U-turn for the region. But it's gonna be complicated because also led by Saudi Arabia, the Arab group in the negotiations. So actually all of those, what we talk about, the mitigation, the adaptation, and the finance, they are all linked to one another. So the Saudi Arabia led by the Arab group, when they go to the negotiations, they also ask for an inclusive approach in including all of those aspects in the global stocktake, for example, because they don't want their economies to negatively impacted by the climate change. So yeah, let's see how the UAE presidency is gonna tackle the just energy transition. It's not easy as well in practice.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because the global stocktake is a 5-year cycle, and the next 5-year global stocktake will also be in an Asia-Pacific country. So I think Asia-Pacific is really poised, to lead on this inclusive and just transition, as you so rightly pointed out. I just wanted to invite David and Angel to give any thoughts on this as well.
Angel slays more than me, so go for it.
Well, I think Aisha gave an incredibly comprehensive response, but I was also, when you were presenting and you had as one of the goals for COP28, I wrote that down with a big question mark. Like, what do they mean by that? Because I don't think that that's clear at all, and everyone has different definitions. And I think you're right. It's really going to shine a spotlight on oil-based economies like the UAE to really come out and say, okay, well, what is the clear plan? And that's really, I think, one of the charges for this COP is that every country and also businesses, as part of the H-leg, the high-level expert group on net zero, there's a mandate that every company actually develops a transition plan. How are they going to transition away from fossil fuels? And right now, there's no clear definition or standardization of what that means. So that's also going to be on sharp focus on accountability. And I do agree with you. I think that UAE is making some progress, but I also know that they're investing in oil 4 times as much as they are in renewables. So to me, there's still a disconnect. And I'm hoping that this is not going to be a greenwashing COP and that they're going to come forward with some actual concrete steps, because I think a lot of countries are struggling. You mentioned Asia Pacific. 60% of electricity in this region is generated by coal. I mean, We have to think about, we have to stop as soon as possible here in the region. And yeah, it's going to require a lot of reskilling. I think China is a great example of how they're taking workers in the coal and iron and steel sectors and reskilling them to be gearbox operators and maintainers on wind turbines. I think in the United States, there have been a shutdown of most major coal companies and also need for reskilling. So this is where I think if the UAE could, they have a platform for sharing these lessons, these case studies, so that parties and countries can actually share and say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're reskilling. Also, I think one thing you didn't mention is the digital economy. And I think that's really going to be a game changer. AI, I think we're all actually need to be reskilled. So I was at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum here in Singapore. So the Minister of Education from Singapore was there, and he was talking about Singapore's plans for AI. And he said most of the time when we talk about education, it's we think about it kindergarten and high school. But actually, he said the most relevant education moving forward is actually going to be adult learners. And he was absolutely right, because AI is going to eliminate so many different jobs. So I think everybody, not just on fossil fuel, but I think we're going to have to be thinking about just transitions for every sector of society, because now we're seeing so many disruptions, including climate change. And David, I think, gave a lot of really good figures about disasters and risk multipliers. But then also, I think, the need to transition away from fossil fuels, and then also AI and these other potential disruptive technologies and innovations that are going to reshape. So actually, that's one area where I think UAE has also made a big commitment, is to think about digitalization. I think Singapore also is well poised to think about how they can make that the new high growth economic sector to shift away from oil refining and other fossil fuel based activity. So I don't know, that was a little bit out of left field, but just.
No, that's okay. Okay, well, the time just flew by, and so we do have to draw this to a close because we've exceeded our time allocation. And we're, of course, not able to take all of your questions, but I'm very encouraged by the quality and of the questions and how thought-provoking they are. We will forward them to the speakers for their further consideration. And of course, you may also reach out to them directly. They're doing all such great research and amazing work. So thank you again for being with us today. And of course, to those of you who are watching online or watching the recording, wherever you are in the world, thank you so much for joining and for your active listening. Now it just leaves me to thank, of course, NUS and the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions for organizing this lecture. COP28, are we on track to averting climate catastrophe? I think it's safe to say we're not quite there yet, but we are heading into a potential course correction COP. Right? So in 2 weeks in Dubai. So thank you very much again to Aisha, David, and Angel. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their insights today. And thank you so much to our audience. Please stay safe, keep fighting the good fight, and keep the hope up, and have a great week and weekend ahead. Goodbye. Thank you.